morning, dear teacher. Our lesson today is titled Call to Oneness, and we are going to be studying the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 8 to 22. The overall aim of our lesson today will be to help people understand that in Christ there is no ethnic, racial, or cultural differences. Before we begin, I want us to have an idea of the background from which, or the context from which Apostle Paul was writing. The Jews grew up with the notion that salvation was reserved only for them because they were a chosen nation. And so, because of this, when Jesus Christ, the Messiah, came and preached and said that you can only get to God through him, that is John 14:6, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And even when Jesus declared that he is a Messiah and that he's going to bring salvation to everyone, like in John 3:16, that God loved the world, that whoever, not just the Jews, who believe in him will not perish but have everlasting life. So this gospel, as I call it, which is actually the gospel, offended the Jews a lot because they thought that salvation was meant just for them. They felt that they were the only ones who had access to God by virtue of their religion and their tradition, the Jewish tradition. They knew that Moses was their father, and so observing the Jewish tradition and laws and the laws of and the Ten Commandments was a pivotal aspect in their tradition. So anyone who did not belong to the chosen family, that is the Jews, were considered as Gentiles, and they were automatically regarded as enemies. So the Jews regarded the Gentiles as enemies because they assumed that they were not part of God's divine plan, and that's the mistake they made. And when Jesus came and spoke something contrary to what they thought, they were offended and they called Jesus a blasphemer. One of the reasons why Jesus was crucified. So when Jesus was crucified, he died, his blood was shed on the cross to save mankind as he had prophesied or as he had declared. And so he left behind the gospel with the apostles. And of course, we know the story of Apostle Paul, who was actually one of the Jewish practitioners who persecuted the Christians. But when he received Christ and he understood the concept of the gospel, he started preaching. So he had preached to the Christians in Ephesus. So he was writing this letter while in prison, trying to encourage them to understand that the gospel is not just, or the relationship with God or salvation is not just for the Jews, but it's for everybody, including the Gentiles. That's why last week we learned that the Gentiles were chosen. Apostle Paul was telling them that they were chosen in the divine plan of God. So the divine plan of God was misunderstood by the Jews, who thought that they were the only ones who had access to God. The divine plan of God had everyone in it, including the Gentiles. Apostle Paul made it very clear that no one should boast of salvation because salvation is a free gift from God. That's the first thing you have to understand. We have to understand that it has nothing to do with whether you're a Jew or you're a Gentile. It's a free gift from God. If you believe by faith in Christ, you will receive it. That's the first thing. And so no one should go about boasting that he or she is the only one who has access to God. Likewise, in our nation, Cameroon, we have different tribes, we have different cultures. There are some cultures or tribes who believe that there are certain advantages that are reserved only for them. And because of that, this creates hostility between different ethnic groups and tribes or race. And God is saying that he owns everything. So there's no reason for any tribal or cultural differences like it existed between the Jews and the Gentiles. So salvation is free for everyone. Now, because of this hostility that existed between the Jews and the Gentiles, Jesus came. If you study the book of Ephesians chapter 2, our text from verse 12 to 13, you see that Jesus came here as a mediator to break the wall that existed between the Jew and the Gentile. So he brought the Jew and the Gentile together to form a new man in him. That is why Jesus is called the Prince of Peace, because Jesus came to bring peace between the Jews and the Gentiles. You can read that in verse 12 and verse 13. So because of Jesus, there is peace. There was no hostility. And so being a new man, anyone who receives Jesus Christ is a new person. And once you are a new person, you no longer grow up with the mentality that there is a tribal or religious or ethnic differences. So Jesus brought peace. Christ brought peace between the Jews and the Gentile. And he actually had to break that barrier that existed between them. You can see that in verse 14 of our text. And if you move ahead, you will see that for in Christ we have been united in him. And the Gentiles, because they have been united in Christ, Jew and Gentile, they now have full rights to the to God in God's household. There's a difference between a house and a household. A household means that they belong to God's family and they are regarded or they have the same bloodline with Jesus Christ. This was God's original plan to save mankind. So it's very important for our students to understand that God had a plan from the beginning, from the time the foundation of the earth was laid. He had a plan that everyone is going to be saved, and not just the Jews. But the Jews grew up with the idea that they were the chosen generation and they were the only ones who had access to God. So God or Jesus came to break this idea, to reveal to them that the salvation plan of God was meant for everybody. So how can this lesson be applied to our current day dispensation, especially in our nation, Cameroon? The problem is that Cameroon has so many ethnic groups, so many cultural differences. And because of these cultural differences, there are some ethnic groups who think that they are superior or better off, or they have access to other things with regards to the national cake more than other groups of people. So the challenge is that we have to come together, receive Jesus Christ. If our leaders, if we ourselves receive Jesus Christ, there will be peace because Jesus Christ brought peace between the Jews and the Gentiles. So if we receive Jesus Christ, there will be peace between the different cultural groups. If you did enjoy this video, do not hesitate to hit the subscribe button, like, share, and also make your comments at the bottom of the YouTube video. Thank you very much for listening and hope to see you in the next episode. My name is Ginny.